Every year, on the anniversary of my brother's disappearance, I have the same routine. I guess you'd call it a ritual. It starts with me going upstairs to the attic. The ritual has changed slightly over the years, but at its core it's still the same. I get away for a while, on my own, and try to reconnect with the past. Lose myself for a bit. My wife and kids leave me to it. They know the significance of the date, and they know I like to have my own space. The only thing they don't know is what exactly I get up to when I'm off on my own. What the ritual involves. And you know what? I don't think I'm ever going to tell them. Walking upstairs to the attic this afternoon, it all came flooding back to me. The memories from that day. 25 years is a long time, but as I made my way across the floorboards at the top of my house, the light from my torch picking out dust motes in the darkness, it didn't feel like a long time. The past felt close. I could see the shadow-draped roof beams and the cardboard boxes, and I could picture myself in a different attic altogether. An attic from my past. And when I paused and shut my eyes, I could see Ben beside me. As I made my way to the wooden trunk pushed back into the far corner, the same trunk I open every year, I remembered. My little brother disappeared 2 weeks after we moved house. It was our first major move as kids. We'd grown up in a town, but for years our mum and dad had been desperate for us all to live in the countryside. It was a dream of theirs. And not long after I turned 10, we finally managed it. I loved that house. Both of us did. It was an old cottage set in the middle of a village on the edge of the New Forest, and we knew it was perfect the moment we set eyes on it. My brother was a couple of years younger than me, and at that point in time we were going through what my mum liked to call our adventurous phase, an expression she normally accompanied with an exasperated voice and a roll of the eyes. Ben and I loved exploring stuff. It didn't matter what. Climbing trees. Building rafts. Investigating the abandoned sawmill that sat alongside a footpath a mile from the village. As soon as we moved, we were in new territory, and we did our best to investigate it as quickly and as thoroughly as we could. But nothing held our attention quite like the house itself. The place felt like something out of a storybook. It was old. Not old in the same way our previous home had been, but old. Something from a different age. Exposed wooden beams ran across the ceilings. A giant fireplace took up almost a whole wall in the living room. The doorways were so low our dad kept cracking his head when he forgot to duck through them. The house felt like it had secrets, too. Black and white portraits of long-dead people lined the walls, their eyes seeming to track our progress when we walked by. Shadowy nooks and crannies lay in every room. The outline of a tiny door, inexplicably set halfway up the wall in the downstairs bathroom, lay behind damp and peeling paper. For 2 kids who loved frightening themselves and daring each other, it was heaven. And the main object of our attention quickly became the attic. We found out about the attic from Mr. Richards. He was our new next-door neighbor. Mr. Richards was a skinny, grey-haired man who lived on his own. To my brother and me he looked about as old as the house itself. Possibly older. We were playing football in our back garden about a week after we'd moved in, and I can still remember the way his voice made me jump. "You boys explored the attic yet?" Ben had the ball and I was going in for a tackle when Mr. Richards spoke. We both froze and spun around to find him leaning against the wooden fence that ran between our gardens. Watching us. Yeah, we went up there on our first day. It was Ben who answered. Although Ben was younger, he seemed to have been born with a confidence I'd yet to find. Although we did everything together, it was often Ben who came up with the ideas. And it was usually Ben who spoke to adults. We helped our dad shift some boxes up there when we moved. No, not that attic. Mr. Richards grinned at us, and I was mildly disgusted to see 2 of his front teeth were missing. I mean the other attic. The secret one. He had our attention now. Ben and I walked a couple of paces closer to the fence, the ball forgotten behind us. Once again, it was Ben who answered. "How do you mean, secret attic?" Mr. Richards reached up a hand and scratched at the stubble peppering his cheek. The sun slipped from behind a cloud overhead, and he squinted his eyes at us. "What I mean is I've been in your house before. Knew the people that lived there before you. I know the layout, see? And let me guess, the attic you put them boxes in is through that white cupboard door in the hallway. The one above the stairs." Ben and I looked at each other without saying anything. Mr. Richards was right. We'd both been there on the day Dad had climbed up through that little white door, balancing one foot on the banister before pushing himself up to reach it. We'd passed the boxes up to him, with the promise that he'd help us climb up so we could see inside too at the end. It had been disappointing. The space in the cupboard extended away towards the back of the house, but there was nothing inside but beams and insulation. Mr. Richards didn't wait for us to respond. "Well, that's not the real attic," he continued. "The real attic is above that one, and you can only get to it through a secret passageway." His grin widened, showing more brown teeth. He tipped me a wink. "Where's the secret passage then?" Ben's eyes were wide. He had the same look on his face he'd had when our dad told us about the abandoned sawmill near the village. A sort of hungry look. Mr. Richards tapped the front of his shirt pocket. He reached inside with his bony, nicotine-stained fingers and pulled out a cigarette. He placed it between his lips, then rummaged around in the pocket of his jeans for a lighter. As he bent to light the cigarette, he shook his head. "You boys got to be careful, that's what I think. Some places aren't meant for kids. Doesn't do no good to go poking round." "Then what did you tell us about it for?" Ben looked outraged. The color had risen in his cheeks. He reached up and brushed a lock of sweaty dark hair from his face, without taking his eyes off Mr. Richards. "We won't do anything stupid, we promise." Mr. Richards cackled. He held the cigarette away from his mouth and blew smoke through his nose. After a moment the laughter tapered off into a thick, hacking cough. Once he'd recovered, he drew the sleeve of one arm across his mouth and stared at us through watery blue eyes. "Well, I can't tell you much more than that. I wouldn't want your parents getting mad at me, of course. If I could tell you anything, what I might say is that some of these old houses are odd shapes and sizes. There are some places, for instance, that have these huge old fireplaces. Big chimneys breasts, too. If I were you, that's what I'd be aiming for. I'd be wondering if maybe there weren't some small steps running up the outside of that big chimney, little brick steps inside the first attic leading up into a hidden roof space." He took another drag on his cigarette and winked again. Ben and I looked at each other. We didn't even need to say anything. That's how it was with me and Ben. More often than not we could communicate with just a look. That day we turned around together to face the house, and were about to go running for our front door when Mr. Richards' voice stopped us. "I'd be careful though, if I were you. I mean it." We paused and looked back at him. He took another drag on his cigarette and stared at us, the smile gone from his face. "Some of the places in this village have stories attached to them. Stories almost as old as the houses themselves. People that lived in that place before you said they heard things. Noises in the night. Told me they'd wake up sometimes, and there would be these sounds coming from the roof space above them. Sort of like echoes. A gust of wind blew through the garden, making the trees rustle. Suddenly all I could think of were those black and white portraits hanging in our hallway. The ones with eyes that seemed to follow you." "Oh yes, I'd be very careful indeed," said Mr. Richards. "Some of these houses have hidden places that no one's been to for years and years. And some might have doors that aren't meant to be opened. Don't worry, we'll be careful." Ben's hand was on my arm, tugging me. I could feel the excitement in that tug, and I already knew he'd hardly been listening to the last part of what Mr. Richards said. We turned together and made our way to the house. I paused by the porch and glanced back. Mr. Richards was still in the same place we'd left him, leaning against the fence, watching. Our expedition into the attic took place a week later. We'd wanted to go sooner, of course, but it hadn't been possible. Not with our parents about. They didn't mind us going off on our own, but they'd marked the attic as strictly out of bounds. We knew we had to wait until they were out of the house together, and the following Friday evening we finally got our wish. Mum was already out visiting a friend, and a call to our landline summoned Dad back into the office. "Something's come up at work," he told me, a frown on his face as he shrugged his coat on by the front door. "Will you two be all right on your own for an hour? I shouldn't be long, and your mum's due back soon anyway." Dad worked as the editor for a local paper, and things were always coming up at work. It was a constant source of arguments between him and Mum. But while Dad disappearing to the office would normally fill me with a low-level anxiety I didn't quite understand back then, at that moment it only excited me. It meant we'd finally have the house to ourselves. As I nodded and told him we'd be okay, it was all I could do to keep the grin from my face. 10 minutes later, my brother and I stood on the stairs below the attic's white door. This was a trip we were ready for. In an effort to distract ourselves from the frustration of not being able to find the secret attic right away, we'd spent the last week planning. Maps. Supplies. A communication system. We had it all ready. By drawing a rough pencil sketch of the house, we'd worked out what Mr. Richards meant by the steps in the side of the chimney breast. The lower attic, as we'd come to call it, stretched from above the hallway to the very back wall of the house. This was the attic we'd already been in with Dad. It ran above the downstairs bathroom and parallel to the lounge. And what was the main feature of the lounge, which also happened to sit against the house's back wall? The fireplace. So if I get to the end and look to the left I should be right by where the chimney breast is? Asked Ben, staring up at the white door above our heads. Yep, that's it. Mr. Richards said brick steps run up the outside of the chimney. He said those are the steps that lead up into the attic at the very top of the house. The secret one. I stood on the step beside Ben and followed his gaze to the door above our heads. Sure you want to do this on your own? This was the main problem we'd come up against early on in the planning stages. No matter how many different ways we tried it, we couldn't figure out a way for both of us to climb up into the attic together. Whenever our parents were out of sight, we tried everything we could think of, lifting each other up, balancing on the banister, trying to stand on top of random objects we placed on the stairs. Nothing worked. Because of its position above the staircase, reaching the door to the attic was awkward. It was okay when our dad had been up there because he'd been able to reach down and haul us up, but for two kids who were barely 4.5 feet tall, the process was a nightmare. In the end, the only way we'd been able to manage it was by Ben climbing onto the banister and me boosting him the rest of the way by locking my hands together in a foothold. But once he'd reached the doorway and pulled himself through, we knew there had been no easy way for me to follow him. Staring up at that door, Ben brushed his dark hair from his eyes. His face was fixed in a determined expression I'd seen plenty of times before. "Sure," he said. "You got your walkie. Boxes, all the boxes we put up here with Dad." Ben's voice crackled through the black box in my hand. The walkie-talkies had been my idea. They'd been a present from Dad for my 10th birthday. We'd tested them out a few times when we were out exploring the village, but up until now we hadn't really found a proper use for them. But they were perfect for this. They meant Ben could tell me exactly what he was seeing the whole time he was up there. We'd even come up with a system. Once every 10 seconds at least, Ben would radio back to me with an update. Just a word or two, to tell me what he could see at that exact moment. I told him it was so I could keep an accurate log of everything, but really it was so I'd be able to know he was safe. From my vantage point at the top of the staircase, I could just see into the open white door above my head. The darkness glowed with the beam from Ben's head torch. I pressed the button on my walkie. "Can you see the back wall of the attic yet?" "No, not yet. I'm just getting past all the boxes. It's tricky cause there's all that green stuff on the floor, so I can only step on the beams." "You mean the insulation?" "Yeah." "Well, go slow, okay? If you step on that stuff by accident, your foot could go through the ceiling. Then we'll really be screwed." I glanced at the digital watch on my wrist. Garnate. Had Dad said what time Mum was due home? I couldn't remember. The last thing we wanted was for her to get back while Ben was still in the attic, though, so I was on high alert, straining my ears for the sound of a car coming down the road by our house. We had a system for this, too. If I heard Mum pulling up in the driveway, I'd press the button on the walkie and call Mayday 3 times. And if Ben got into any trouble up there, he'd do the same. For the time being, though, there was no approaching engine in earshot. There was nothing much at all in earshot, for that matter. I could hear the wind gusting outside, and the occasional creak as the house settled around me, but nothing else. My brother and I were alone. "It's freaky up here, Max." Ben's voice was a low whisper issuing from the walkie's speaker. "There's cobwebs everywhere. It's like nobody's been up here for 100 years. I shivered. Although I was wearing a thick jumper, it felt cold in the hallway. There was something about Ben's words that caused a faint worm of unease to stir in my stomach, too. What was it Mr. Richards had said to us the week before? Some of these houses have hidden places that no one's been to for years and years. That was a weird thought, wasn't it? Ben might be the first person to see the secret attic in a long, long time. Maybe even since the house itself was built. Mr. Richards had said something else, too, that I couldn't quite remember. Something about doors that weren't meant to be opened. "Max? Max? You there?" Ben's voice almost made me jump. I lifted the walkie to my mouth and pressed the talk button. "Here, Ben. What's up? What can you see?" "The back wall's up ahead, Max. I can see it with my torch. And there's something else, too." The worm of unease twisted in my belly. "What?" "There's this dark patch up in the corner of the attic, over to the left. It looks like a hole in the wall." A weird mix of emotions filled my stomach. There was excitement down there, sure, the kind of nervous energy I'd felt before going on a roller coaster the first time, but there was something else, too. A faintly sick feeling. For the first time since we'd started this mission, I had the sudden urge to call Ben back. I didn't know why I felt this, exactly, but it was there all the same. A nagging in my belly. Ben wouldn't come easily, that was the thing. He didn't seem to get anxious about stuff the same way I did, but I thought I might be able to convince him if I needed to. And if that failed, I could always tell him Mum was home. My thumb hovered over the talk button, but I hesitated. What exactly was I worried about? It was just an attic. It might be old, and it might be full of cobwebs, but that's all it was. Just another roof space that we hadn't been in yet. And before I had a chance to think any more about it, Ben's voice crackled through the speaker again. "Beams, more cobwebs. There's a low beam running from the left to the right." Ben was listing everything he could see. Another 10 seconds, another update. Sticking to the plan. "I'm near the end now, Max. I can see bricks on the left, more bricks. Oh, hang on, there's stairs, Max." I can see little stairs on the left, leading up into the darkness. He'd found it. Found the secret way up that Mr. Richards had mentioned. I didn't know what I'd been expecting, exactly, but just then it felt like the unease in my belly was winning out over the excitement. My stomach felt the way it did at school before a test. I strained my ears, listening for the sound of a car on the road, and right then I was hoping I'd hear it. I was hoping Mum would come back. That way I could call Mayday to Ben, and the game would be off. There was nothing, though. Just the wind outside, and the silence of the hallway. Then the sudden crackle of static barking through the box in my hand. Max, you still there? I'm on my way up, Max. I climbed up on the beam, and I'm about to go up the stairs. I can't see anything up there yet. It's dark. Be careful. It was all I could manage. I stared up at the open white door above me, trying to see if I could still make out the faint glow of Ben's head torch. I couldn't. He must be so far back now that the light wasn't getting out. Brick steps, more brick steps, cobwebs. Ben's voice sounded fainter now. Further away. I wasn't sure if it was the extra wall and distance between us or if he'd started whispering. I glanced around the hallway, trying to distract myself from the growing unease in my stomach, and my eyes fell on a portrait on the wall beside me. One of those old black and white ones. An elderly woman, impossibly small and shrunken, stared out of the frame. Her black eyes watched me from an expressionless face. A young man, equally devoid of expression, stood beside her. His face reminded me faintly of Mr. Richards. I shut my eyes. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my neck, above the sound of the wind outside the house. Thump, thump, thump. The problem was me being down here on the landing while Ben was up there. We had the walkie-talkies, sure, but it wasn't the same. We were normally together in all our games. Now I felt unable to help, and it was making my anxiety worse. To distract myself, I tried to imagine things from Ben's point of view. Picture what he was seeing. Feel his excitement. It didn't help. I could see the darkness in my mind's eye, imagine his torch beam cutting a path of light through the shadows. But the image only gave me the creeps. More darkness, geez, it's really dark up here, Max. It's like my torch isn't working properly. He'd be close to the top, now. I could feel it. Almost in the secret attic. In my head I had a sudden flash back to Mr. Richards, leaning against our garden fence. Grinning. More brick steps, more darkness. Hey, are you sure you want me to keep updating you? Even if it's all the same stuff. What I wanted was for Ben to give up and come back. Stupidly, though, I didn't say that. I just thumbed the button and said, yes. Okay, I think I must be nearly, yep, I'm at the top now. Ben's voice had dropped to a whisper again. I thought I could detect a hint of uncertainty in it, but it could have been my imagination. The stairs have stopped, Max. It's really dark up here. Was that the sound of a car engine in the distance? I shut my eyes again, straining my ears, but I couldn't tell. The wind was playing tricks on me. Dark wooden beams, dark. Was Ben speaking even more quietly? His voice sounded like it was coming through a pipe. Dark, dark, wait, hang on. The worm of unease was a not now. It felt like something alive and moving inside me. There's Max. There's something here. Up ahead. A car engine. Yes, I could hear it now. Over the wind. There was no mistaking it. There's a door, Max. Ben's voice was ragged and faint, and I could no longer detect the excitement in it. Now all I could hear was the fear I felt myself. It's in the middle of the attic. It's dark red. The knot of worms clenched tighter. The people in the black and white photo leered out at me. In the distance, the hum of the car engine grew. I moved my thumb over the talk button, ready to call Mayday, but Ben spoke again before I had the chance. It's red, a red door. The walkie growled static in my hand. Ben's voice was almost lost in it. His next words were the last full sentence I ever heard him speak. I'll keep my thumb down as I go through it. Ben, no, don't. Mayday, Mayday. I hammered down the talk button and yelled into the walkie, but it didn't work. Static still crackled through the speaker. Mayday. Mum's here, Ben, come back. Mayday. Time seemed to slow down. The thing I remember most about what happened next was the sound. 4 sounds, all blurring together into one. There was the bass drum of my heartbeat, high up in my neck, and the background howl of the wind. There was the sound of Mum's car, drawing closer to the house. And there was the static. The static surged from the black box in my hand and, for a short time, eclipsed everything else. It was like my brother had walked into the center of a storm. The sound seemed to freeze me in place. I should have tried the talk button again, and I should have yelled at the top of my voice Ben was only in the roof after all, wasn't he? But I did neither of those things. Instead I simply stood there, the eyes in the black and white portraits gazing on, as cracked noise blared from the box in my hand. There were words in that static. I don't know how much time passed as I drowned in that wave of sound, but I heard them. I heard my brother's voice. It was impossibly distant, and I had to press my ear tight to the walkie to hear it at all, but it was there. The ultra-faint whisper of someone speaking from a long, long way away. Dark, dark, dark. Looking back now, I think the words must have been every 10 seconds. I think it was Ben, sticking to the plan. Even then, dark, dark, dark. Static surged and roared like waves. There were only 2 other words I heard Ben speak before the car pulled up in our driveway: pink moon. I guess there's a chance I misheard him, but I don't think so. Nobody believed me. That's the short version. I could go into the longer version, the interrogations from my parents, and the police officers, and eventually the psychiatrists, but no one needs to hear all that. It's a story we've heard before. There are only really a few other points that matter. The first is the walkie-talkies. They didn't find anything. I told everyone the truth and stuck to it, but it made no difference. When first my dad, and then the lead investigator, listened to the channel my walkie had been tuned to, all they heard was static. They told me I had to be imagining the sound of my brother's voice. The attic was empty, too. I don't know how many people went up there and searched in the end, but it was a lot. And none of them found a single trace. No dropped walkie-talkie. No Ben. Their big theory, which I learned from cupping my ear to closed doors whenever I could in the ensuing weeks, was that I'd made the whole thing up. A defense mechanism, they called it. They thought Ben had been abducted, or he'd gotten lost while we were playing some game outside. They thought my mind had created the whole red door in the attic story as a way of protecting itself, shielding me from the trauma of whatever really happened. As for my own investigations, I only went up into the attic once. It was months later, after the initial investigation into Ben's disappearance had died down. The stairs in the chimney were there, just like he said they were, but nothing else. The secret attic was nothing more than an empty, open space in the roof. Dust and old bat droppings, but no red door. The last thing worth mentioning is Mr. Richards. He died. It was a month or so after Ben disappeared that I finally thought to talk to him. He was the one who'd told us about the attic, after all, but I never got the chance. His granddaughter found him, apparently. She got worried after he stopped answering his phone. I overheard my parents talking about it late one night, and my dad said he'd heard from Mrs. Roberts down the road that some things had been found in Mr. Richards' house. Some disturbing things. I never found out what that meant, though, and it could have just been a rumor. They held a funeral for him in the village church. Advertised it on the notice board. The poster they used had a blown-up photo of Mr. Richards when he was younger, in black and white. When I saw it for the first time, it looked familiar to me, but it was only later I realized how much it reminded me of the black and white photo on the landing in our house. I used it to take the walkie-talkie everywhere I went. Everywhere. I carried it in my bag to school, slept with it under my pillow. I always had it in arm's reach. I learned to stop that, though, over the years. It wasn't helping. I was spending so much time in that sea of static that I realized if I didn't take control soon, I might just drown. So now I ration myself. Now I have my ritual. Every year I go upstairs to the attic of the house I currently live in with my wife and kids, and I retrieve the walkie-talkie from its locked wooden trunk. Find the old channel. Then I close my eyes and let the static wash over me, and I listen for my brother's voice. It's still there. Even after all this time, it's still there. Mostly he repeats the same word he was whispering when he walked through the red door, dark. But every now and then I'll catch something else. On a couple of occasions he's spoken about the pink moon again, and a few years ago I thought he said the words cracked sky. And this year, quite clearly, I heard him whisper something he's never said before, Silver Lake. I talk back to him, too, sometimes. Even though he's never responded, and even though I know deep down that he probably can't hear me, I talk to him just in case. Because if there's even the slightest chance that he can, he'll know I've